Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Sasha, who will run through some housekeeping and introduce you to our agenda today.
Thank you for joining us for our NHS Trust An Introduction to Heat Network Funding webinar. My name is Sasha Smith and I work for GemServe, which is part of the Triple Point Heat Networks team, which delivers the Green Heat Network Fund. We have a brilliant lineup of speakers who will delve into what heat networks are and the available support for NHS trusts. Before we get started, I'll cover some quick housekeeping bits. So today we're using Teams Live, which is very similar to usual Teams meetings, yet has a function where you can ask questions in the Q&A. You can find the icon at the top right-hand corner of your screen. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them in this function. You can use your name or ask them anonymously. You can also like someone's questions, which will boost the question higher up and show that more people are interested in the answer. So this is what today's agenda looks like. We're excited to be joined by Tom from the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero and Mary from the NHS. Lauren from the Triple Point Heat Networks team and Louise will also be speaking. So over to Tom.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Tom Allard. I'm the Green Heat Network Fund Scheme Design Manager and a Heat Network Specialist from the Heat Network Delivery Unit. Next slide, please. So in this section, I'm going to be talking about the context of why heat is important and how heat networks can play into that. Decarbonisation of electricity is relatively straightforward. We know roughly how to do it, and there's a strategy in place to get there. There's only one single big electricity distribution company, and there's only a handful of distribution network operators. And when we're talking about generators, there's only a couple of hundred of those as well. So it's a relatively small constrained market. The pathway to net zero for electricity is simple. However, heat is a much bigger challenge. There are millions of individual players in heat market. Each building has its own heat generation equipment. It's a really complex space to get into. And if we're going to get to net zero by 2050, the government needs to have a really big focus and tight look at how we're going to do that. Next slide, please. So if you look at the graph on the right, it sets out the different uses and production of carbon. And you can see that heat is 30% of the total amount of carbon we produce in this country. It's a really big player. Transport is another big player. And then below that, there's industry and agriculture. And then when we're looking at heat, roughly 7% of that is industrial heat, where you're making things using heat. But really the vast majority, 23%, is for heating homes, hot water, public and commercial space. So it's a really big component of our carbon emissions and our focus for decarbonising. There are 30 million buildings in the UK, and 95% of those are on gas, and with each of those got an individual gas boiler. So the size of the challenge is really, really large. And if we're going to move away from gas boilers, we need to find a credible alternative that can ensure that everyone has the thermal comfort that they need, but also in a low carbon way. One of our commitments as a government is to make sure that new builds are low carbon from the start. And so the government's commitment to get 300,000 new homes each year from the mid-2020s, the main focus of those is low carbon from the beginning. But that's only a relatively small chunk of the homes and buildings that are going to be in existence in 2050. Only 20% of all the buildings that are going to still be there. New build is not going to solve our problem. We need to find a solution for our existing building stock, because that's going to be 80% of the buildings by the time we need to be fully net zero. So supply chain and decarbonisation pathways is really key on what we need to do. Next slide, please. So new build from the start, low carbon, that's great, but we've got that big chunk of existing buildings which are off the gas grid and existing buildings which are on the gas grid. So the options for buildings off gas grid are simpler because there are fewer opportunities and different routes. Essentially, low carbon technologies for off gas grid at the moment include things like heat pumps and biomass boilers. So there are opportunities there. There are some small opportunities for heat networks, but they're relatively moderate. Heat networks work better where you've got really big, high density of heat demand. So then when we move on to the existing buildings on the gas grid, a big chunk of that will hopefully and potentially be met by low carbon heat networks. The CCC identified that there's the opportunity to decarbonise using heat networks with about 20% of our building stock, heat demand. So we need to be moving from where we are now, which is in the 2-3%, to that roughly 18 to 20% of market penetration from low carbon heat networks if we are going to achieve our low carbon and decarbonisation ambitions. There's some potential to decarbonise the existing gas grid with biomethane being injected into the grid, but the capability of producing enough feedstocks to produce enough biomethane to do that is relatively limited, so that potential is more likely to sit within individual building solutions and as a transitional decarbonisation of the gas going into the grid rather than a final solution. Then there's potential for hydrogen being injected into the gas grid as well, and then other individual building solutions such as heat pumps. But in general, it's quite a challenging space. As mentioned on the previous slide, 30 million buildings we need to think about solutions for. So a good option is the heat network, which allows multiple buildings to be decarbonised at once using various different technologies. Next slide, please. So as a quick reminder of what heat networks actually are, you have a centralized energy center which generates your heat. At the moment, that might be through a gas CHP unit, but in the future, we will be looking for heat pumps or hydrogen CHP or waste heat sources which are providing heat to that energy center. That then goes into a primary distribution network which runs pipes through the streets, which are then connected up to buildings where the heat is distributed within the building through pipes in a secondary network, and then that goes into individual units within that building in the tertiary network. At the moment, we have roughly 14,000 communal and district heat networks, something like 2,500 district networks within that 14,000, and that provides heat at the moment to about 480,000 customers, a relatively small component of the overall heat provision in this country at the moment, and much smaller than in many other European countries. So in Scandinavia, we're looking at 50% of urban heat demand, residential heat demand provided by heat networks, and larger, smaller amounts, but still quite substantial, 10 and 25 in places like France and Holland. Next slide, please. So the distribution across the country in the UK is quite broad. It focuses on urban centres. So you'll see on the map on the right that it's broken down by regions and districts there, but the main focus is where there are bigger towns, because that's where you'd more commonly find them, because they work best where you've got higher density heat demand. At the moment, we supply 10 terawatt hours of annual heat demand through He Networks, and if we're looking to increase that to 20% of all buildings and heat demand, that would rise to about 100 terawatt hours of annual heat demand. Still mostly gas, but as we progress towards 2025 and 2030 and then 2050, we're looking to implement policies and financial support to help decarbonise those existing heat networks and to build new heat networks which are low carbon from the start. Next slide, please. So one of the key important features of heat networks, which makes them an important plank of our decarbonisation strategy, is that they're able to access broader range of heat supplies than other technologies. So they're relatively technology agnostic. If hydrogen becomes a solution, you can have hydrogen powered heat networks. If electrification is a solution, you can have heat pumps. They can access waste heat from industry and commercial heat from places like data centers, and because of their scale, you can cost effectively tap into deep geothermal or mine water heat, which you would not be able to do on an individual building setting, and because of the costs of digging down deep is too high. But with a heat network, you would be able to do that. So there are lots of benefits from using heat networks to society in allowing that broader range of heat technologies to input into our decarbonisation solution. It does also mean that there's greater resilience, because you can tap into multiple different heat supply sources. So if there's a failure in one heat supply, you can go to another, and it also allows smart relations with the grid. So when electricity is cheap, it can be used to heat a giant hot water tank, and you can store the heat for later use later that day when the electricity costs are more expensive. So there is a broader range of things that you can do to make it cost effective to society to implement this type of technology for heat decarbonisation. And for those reasons, it is one of our central scenarios for reaching net zero by 2050, as whatever pathway we take to decarbonisation, heat networks can play into that. And it's therefore a no regrets technology solution. It is also a large infrastructure project to develop a heat network, so it allows investment and job creation opportunities within urban centres, and we estimate that the value chain for heat network development is something like 60 to 80 billion, with many thousands of high quality jobs being developed to support that as an industry. So there's potential for decarbonisation, there's potential for jobs, there's potential for inward investment across the country and the regions, and so it has value for the department in that way as well. Next slide, please. So in 2021, we published the Heat and Building Strategy, where we set out the role that we envisage heat networks playing within our decarbonisation pathway. It's one of the most important individual policy solutions that we're working towards, and therefore feeds into the energy bill, which is our major piece of legislation going through Parliament right now, which gives us the powers to implement various policy improvements to heat network development. And and we're looking to transform the market using policy levers over the next decade, and through financial support as well, such as the Green Heat Network Fund and the developing of heat network zoning, and consumer protection legislation as well over the next couple of years. Next slide, please. So we had a main focus on heat networks as a policy solution since 2013. The Heat Network Delivery Unit was set up in 2013 to support the development by local authorities of heat networks, looking at mapping and master planning, techno-economic feasibility studies and detailed project development studies, taking a potential heat network solution through to outline business case and full business case approval within local authorities. In 2017, HNIP was started. That was a 320 million capital grant fund, which has supported a number of heat network project development over the last few years. That closed in 2021, and GHNF started, and that's our current low carbon heat network capital fund, which has 288 million funding provided to it. We've also developed the HNES scheme, which has got 30 million for heat network efficiency improvements, and we're developing a heat network skills program to help with training and skill development. We're also working on the energy bill, which will give us primary powers to develop secondary legislation for heat network regulation and engaging with Ofgem as a future regulator for heat networks, focusing on consumer protection and standards within the market. We're also looking through that to develop heat network zones, areas where there will be additional rights and powers for heat network development, and to reduce barriers and friction to development and therefore lower costs and increase the opportunities for companies to invest. Next slide, please. So here we're setting out the interrelationships between HNES, HNU2 and the GHNF, and demonstrating how a potential heat network customer can look through what particular type of scheme would be available to support you, whether or not you need to look at efficiency work and then you flow through into HNES. If you know what you need to do for the efficiency works, you need capital funding to do those improvements, you flow through to HNES capital. If you've got generation equipment that needs replacing and you meet the GHNF low carbon criteria, then you flow through into GHNF. And so it's a step through guide. I'm sure we'll be able to share these slides later to let you understand where you can get capital support or revenue support. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate, our heat network transformation program is aiming to shift the dial on heat network development, moving us from the current 2 to 3% market penetration to 18%, 20% that we're aiming to achieve in a stepped approach. We started off with capital funding. We're then moving into combined regulation and capital funding, and then focusing regulation on decarbonisation in the 2030s. We're focusing on building the market, and so we're going step by step across the different methodologies to do that, and aiming to upskill and expand the supply chain over the coming 7 years so that we are well on the way to delivery and have got the supply chain capable of delivering by the 2030s. Next slide, please. So as part of our policy plan, we're looking at implementing a heat network zoning, and have been running a pilot program over the last year and a half across 28 cities. That's been distributed across the regions of England. It's an England-only scheme as heat network policy development is devolved, and Wales and Scotland are doing something separate on this. In those pilot areas, we've been testing how we might identify where a heat network zone could be, and working with local authorities in those areas to understand the implications for them and what it might mean for them were a heat network zone identified and set up within their areas of administration. So no heat network zones have been created yet, but we've been working through how we might identify them, how we might designate them, what the interactions with the local authority could and should be, and what that would mean. And we'll be working through that until 2025, where the legislation goes live. Next slide, please. So, as mentioned previously, we're looking at our regulation package at the moment, and we have a bill going through Parliament. The main focus of that is supporting the market's growth, introducing proper consumer protections across the board with heat networks, and introducing a regulator which will be Ofgem, and then setting the ground to put into place decarbonisation regulations as we get towards the 2030s, to improve the carbon credentials of both new and existing heat networks. Next slide, please. So the main driver of that will be building reputation and regulatory certainty, making sure that there's a proper regulatory framework in place as we go from a very small market at 2-3% to a big market of 18-20%. We need to make sure that that is working properly for everyone, and that there are proper controls in place to make sure that happens. And where networks are performing poorly, that there are mechanisms in place to improve the outcomes from those poorly performing networks for consumers. We also want to look at reducing development burden and risks. So at the moment, heat network developers do not have the same statutory rights and powers as other utilities, such as gas, electricity and water. When they're digging up streets, they don't have the same rights to do that as those utility companies, and that increases their costs and delays to their work. So we're looking to provide those equivalent powers so that those costs are reduced, those time delays are reduced, increasing the cost effectiveness of heat network development. We're also working to support the standardization of project documentation and guidance so that there's more harmonization and interoperability between heat network operators and developers, so that again there's a reduction in costs due to the ability to use products across different networks. We're working on improving investor understanding of costs and returns. We've recently published a whole life cost of energy tool. We've also published a financial modelling tool, which allows projects to get a better, more effective understanding of how much their existing energy costs for individual buildings, and therefore what the cost benefit would be to them to connect to a network or not to connect to a network, and to improve financial due diligence within heat network operators so that investors can have more confidence in what is going on. And then finally, we're supporting heat networks as a localized solution. So we're working closely with DLUC to ensure that building regulations and SAP work better for heat networks. There are fewer barriers to development and therefore lower costs and cheaper heat for consumers. Next slide, please. So looking towards the regulation of decarbonisation, the Future Home Standard is looking to be introduced in 2025 with improvements to building standards at the same time. So for new builds, that will drive decarbonisation and the decarbonisation of any heat networks connected to those buildings. And then we're looking to introduce regulations directly for heat networks in the 2030s to ensure that existing heat networks start being required to reduce their emissions as we move into the early to late 2030s. With that being the case, new networks are likely to decarbonise faster than existing. We're aiming to get networks built which are designed to be low carbon from the start. Our financial packages, such as Green Heat Network Fund, are designed specifically with that in mind. They only support low carbon heat networks, and they don't support high carbon heat networks. Next slide, please. So that's a whistle stop tour of all that we're doing in the policy space, what our overarching strategy for heat networks entails. Thank you very much. Are we going to go on to questions?
I think it might make sense to pass over to Mary and then pick up more general questions towards the end. Thank you, Mary.
Great, thank you. I can see I'm live now. Hi, morning everyone. Thanks for joining. So today I'll just be covering an introduction to NHS net zero targets and the role that we see heat networks playing in that. Next slides, please. So in 2020, the NHS published its multi-year strategy to become carbon neutral by 2040. This itself starts with an 80% reduction between 2028 and 2032. One of the greatest areas of opportunity for the decarbonisation of hospitals, as we see it, is the buildings, which themselves contribute a significant 15% of the emissions themselves, and with more than 70% of that coming from the way that we heat our buildings and provide hot water, which is what you can see in the pie chart there. That green color is just essentially our gas use, and this is predominantly for heating and providing hot water to our buildings. In October 2021, we also published our state delivery plan, which has a 4-step plan to decarbonize the buildings, which include the decarbonization of our heat, identifying the use of renewable energy and low carbon heat source as a chief contributor to how we intend to do this. The latest NHS net zero building standard itself identifies the need to take advantage of planned heat networks across the country and make the use of hospitals as anchor loads for heat networks and cover new developments and refurbishments that meet the threshold criteria for the building standard. On the back of the strategic documents, trusts are already producing heat decarbonisation plans, with many of them identifying and exploring the opportunities that heat networks can provide. Next slide, please. So heat networks themselves, we see it have a key role to play in supporting the use of the low carbon heat sources and helping us to decarbonize, because it captures heat from a variety of sources. Tom has covered this extensively, so I won't go into too much detail. But as he mentioned, it provides that diversity of heat sources and increases the opportunity to incorporate renewable and low carbon heat sources. Also, with the continuous decarbonization of the grid, all electric heating options, especially the use of heat pump technology, is becoming prevalent in the NHS. Through the PSDS, we're starting to incorporate more and more of this. But what we do know is that in some locations, there are grid constraints that limit our opportunity to utilize standalone heat pump opportunities. And this is where other technologies that the heat networks can provide creates an opportunity. It's also important when we start to think about our older stock, where the retrofitting of fabric improvements to enable lower temperature the heat pumps require for them to be viable in some instances. And we see that, you know, this may prove difficult or either significantly expensive, heat networks are looking at like alternative options in these scenarios as well. So this is where we think we see district heat networks providing significant opportunities to help us decarbonize and in our net zero transition, helping us to generate and distribute heat at scale and allowing low carbon forms of heat generation to be used where it may not necessarily be viable at building scale. Next slide, please. We see heat networks as particularly suited to high population and heat demand, and the heat demand of hospital facilities lend themselves to this. This is thanks to the ability for heat networks to heat multiple buildings from a central source. So the greatest opportunity seen in the UK for heat networks has been where public sector buildings, including hospitals, are close enough to one or more major energy consumers. And we've seen from some of what Tom has presented that under the heat network zoning, it is possible that it will be mandatory for hospitals to connect to heat networks in the future, especially where they act as important anchor loads to help the viability of these networks. This is where hospitals can make an impact, given their need for 24/7 heat and hot water. A number of NHS hospitals have also been identified either as anchor loads or having the potential to benefit from planned heat networks in a number of energy master plans that local authorities have completed. A significant example of this is in London, where some of these energy master plans can be viewed on the Mayor's Dedicated Heat Map resource. This is the map of the Worthing Council's proposed heat network as well. They've put on the slide where the hospital there is also seen as a significant anchor load to the development of that network. So a lot of these opportunities are cropping up and presenting themselves to the NHS. Within the NHS itself, we also already operate a form of localized heat network anyway, making it possible to adapt the operations to a wider network. And this is an area of feasibility that will be explored under the revision of the HTML 702. Next slide, please. Great. So what is the national strategic approach? We've seen the clean growth strategy, which projects the heat network will meet 24% of heat demand in industry and public sector buildings by 2050. The heat and building strategy itself, like Tom highlighted, sets out that national strategic approach, highlighting the important role that heat networks will play in providing not just fiscal support, but also policy support to enable the transition. A lot of this will be covered in this webinar today. So we've got the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme, the Green Heat Network Fund, the Heat Network Delivery Units, and obviously the Heat Network Zoning is mentioned at all the fiscal and policy instruments that can support us alongside the PSDS, which we're already utilizing quite significantly. Regulation of the industry is also well underway. Within the Energy Bill, it is proposed to usher in minimum technical standards, and the Safety Guide CP1 is one of those technical guidance that's already available to help us in the development of these networks as well. There's also local targets. So we're finding, for instance, in London, where there is the pathway to their decarbonisation requires 460 buildings to be connected by 2030. Some of those will be hospitals, and there will be that fiscal and policy support to support this as well. So it's an opportune time for the NHS to take advantage, as we see it, of some of this support to decarbonise as well. Next slide, please. Great. So I'll just summarize here. EAT networks are going to be strategically important to us in terms of our diversity and resilience, and it is an opportune time to capitalize on the fiscal and policy support that it presents to decarbonize our heat load and introduce that diversity and resilience to our supply. We're not necessarily starting from scratch, like I mentioned earlier, and we have a number of exemplar projects already starting to come out of the NHS, one of which is St. James Hospital, which is benefiting from the Leeds Pipes project and helping the hospitals that hospital to save 16,000 tons of carbon annually. So the development of EAT networks could provide a cost-effective and a reliable low-carbon heating to NHS building and help us unlock large-scale renewable heat sources. So that's me done. Thank you.
Thank you very
I'm happy
much,
to take
Mary.
questions now or later. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mary. We're handing over to Tom now.
Great.
Thank you. So I'm a heat network specialist in the heat network delivery unit as well. So I was going to do a quick rundown of the services we can offer through that unit. Next slide, please. So we provide services across England and Wales, support and have supported over 122 projects throughout multiple regions of the country over the last 13 years. Next slide, please. Our main focus is supporting feasibility studies and getting projects from feasibility through to outline business case and then sign off a full business case so that they are ready to go to commercialization and construction, which can be supported through the Green Heat Network Fund. So in HNDU, we provide technical, financial, commercial expertise to potential heat network developers and help with the feasibility study, provide expert feedback on reports which have been commissioned and funded through us. Next slide, please. So we've got a number of specialists we can produce. We have guidance materials. We can help with specifications when commissioning feasibility work. We can then support you throughout the breadth of that project, attending meetings with you to help challenge consultants who have been doing that work for you and provide expert input into those studies where necessary, as well as providing policy context and support with future applications to further capital funding schemes. The main focus of our support will be looking at techno-economic feasibility with you and then getting the detailed project development done. We can also support the funding of external project management. Next slide, please. So when we were set up, we were only for local authorities. Next year, we'll be opening our doors to registered social landlords, NHS trusts, universities, other government departments and property developers. And by next year, I mean next financial year, so from April. We run monthly application rounds starting in April for each year and then running through to December with a hiatus January, February, March to give projects time to finish off any work that they're doing in that year, and we generally start running out of budget November, December. So if you were wanting to get an application in for techno-economic feasibility or detailed project development, do look to try and get into the earlier rounds, as there is more budget available for support in those early rounds. Our next round will be opening sometime in April, and we'll be looking forward to seeing as many applications as come in. Next slide, please. So there is no upper limit for awards. However, we do have expected pricing for things like feasibility studies and detailed project development work. We would generally expect techno-economic feasibility studies to sit within about £60,000 to £70,000 for roughly 6 months work. Whereas detailed project development, we're talking more along the lines of £150,000 for maybe a year's work. It is very dependent on the project and the complexity of the project, how much the costs would vary. Something very simple might be smaller, something complex and large might be more. But we will, as you get through the application, one of our network specialists will talk you through what it might likely to cost in the case of your project and how you might make an application to us. There's a maximum percentage eligibility, so we can only fund 67% of eligible external costs. We can fund 100% of external project management costs if you can make a good enough case to us that it's necessary for us to fund those costs. Next slide, please. So as I've been alluding, it's not just about the money. We do applications, we provide funding, you go out to procure external consultants to provide the studies and the work, but we can engage with you throughout the course of those studies. We can help out in all these areas. We have specific experts within the team, and we've got a number of engineers, we've got a number of finance specialists who can help you with engaging with your consultancy support that you procure, and can challenge and push back from a specialist perspective within the network space, and that can be really useful to bounce ideas. We can be support for you and to make sure that your project is the most appropriate and for your needs, and will be able to apply for any capital funding that might be available most effectively and get the best chances of successful applications. Next slide, please. So just to highlight, we are currently closed to new applications until April. We've got our information about how to apply on our website, but if you want an application pack, email hndu@bays.gov.uk. It will go to our administration team. Pack will be sent out to you, and then you can make an application to that website, that email address as well. So get in contact with us there if you're looking to do any applications with us. We will sort you out with the appropriate information. Next slide, please. So a couple of general tips. It's really helpful to get buy-in from all levels of your organisation before you apply, and get appropriate sign-off before you apply, because we do require letters of approval from senior decision makers. Therefore, if you've got that before your application goes in, you're more likely to be successful. It is also helpful for the project, because it means that progressing the project is easier if you've already got early engagement. Make sure your objectives are clear, so when you're making your application, the assessor for the application can understand easily what you're trying to achieve through this project. And really, really important is make sure you've got enough project management capacity, either in-house, or if you haven't got it in-house, make an application to us. We are able to fund it, and it makes a huge difference to successful projects, having enough people driving the project forward, making sure all the T's are crossed and I's are dotted. It's really, really helpful having the appropriate level of project management capacity. When you make your application, please attach as much supporting information as you've got. There are specific documents which are required. If you attach those to your application at the time, it means that we're not going to have to go back to you and chase you for documents, which then delays the process and means potentially you get pushed into the next round of applications. It makes everything work better. And then we do have a responsive team, so get into contact with us. If you've got any questions, we will help work through them with you. Next slide, please. And then just generally, again, on price, we've got those ranges. You don't have to stick to those ranges, but we would need really strong evidence of why you would be outside of those ranges if you don't stick to them. And just generally on the project management side, as you can see, the feasibility, to get a successful project, it's really close to 1 FTE to drive it forward. Otherwise there will be project delays. It's inevitable. And then when you're looking at DPD, it's really beneficial to have more than 1 FTE of project management time, and just because it's so complex and such a large amount of work needed, that if you've got less than that, you'll struggle to deliver effectively. Brilliant. Next slide, please. There we go. Any questions?
Tom, there's quite a few questions that have come through on the chat. It'd be great if you could have a look through some of those and just see if you can answer any of them in the chat. But I'm going to hand over to Lauren, just because we're a little bit behind time.
Great, thank you. I'll look at the chat.
Good morning, everyone. As it says on there, my name is Lauren Bright. I work for Triple Point, who are the lead for the Triple Point Heat Networks consortium, that look after the Green Heat Network Fund, Beehive, and we also looked after the Heat Network Investment Project. Sasha, can you go next slide? As I said, we've been doing this for a while now, and we are the same team that's been delivering all those projects. So you can see it as Triple Point up at the top there, providing project leadership, business development. So I head up the relationship management team here. We're the people that are the sort of first point of contact for anyone that wanted to apply to any of those schemes. We've got Gemso, who's still on the call, and we've got sort of technical and financial experts in Asteros, ACOM and Amberside. And we also have the clean tech law firm LuxNova in the team, and you'll hear a little bit about the work that they've been doing later on. Next slide, please. So what are we doing? As I said, we looked after the Heat Network Investment Project, got lots and lots of money out to exciting projects all over England and Wales. We are now managing the Green Heat Network Fund and Beehive, which is our heat investment vehicle. And so I'm going to give a whistle-stop tour of both of these in the next couple of minutes, so bear with me. So the Green Heat Network Fund, as you've heard from Tom and the rest of the guys, is a £288 million grant fund available over 3 years. We are ticking down the last few days of that first year at the moment, so we're already getting money out the door. And we are supporting new low carbon heat networks, but also the decarbonisation and expansion of existing networks. So for those of you who potentially have campuses and trusts which have networks on site at the moment. This could be interesting to you, especially if you're one of those that has gas boilers or potentially a CHP at the moment. We're able to provide commercialisation and construction funding, or construction only funding for projects. And this time round, we are just looking at eligible projects in England. Wales have done their own thing this time, but we are available to public, private, third sector organisations, and most importantly for you guys, absolutely open to applications from the NHS this time. I'm going to talk about Beehive a little bit later, but essentially Beehive is our, we've got our GHNF funding, which is our public funding. Beehive has been established to try and draw in that private sector funding into heat networks in the UK. We've set up a PCR compliant procurement platform, so it's a dynamic purchasing system, and that is open to all public sector. And that's to help them get either asset finance or equity investment and the commercialisation services that could come along with that equity investment into projects. And it can be used, as it says here, to finance new heat networks, expand existing networks, or potentially to sell part of an existing operational network. I'm going to go to GHNF first, so to just give you an idea of the scope of support we're looking at here. So Louise is going to talk to you in a minute about HNES and the support for efficiency upgrades to existing networks. GHNF support is here to help with the capital costs of accessing heat sources or low carbon generation. So we're picking up potential connections to waste heat sources, or the costs of heat pump technology, for example, and the primary distribution networks, all the pipes in the ground up until the buildings for those heat networks. We can, in some cases, include the cost of secondary distribution, but if you think about it as primarily, in most cases, up to the point of the heat interface unit, they're the eligible costs that we're talking about supporting with the GHNF. Next slide, please. I'm going to run through very quickly some of our rules and criteria. I know these are important to you guys when you're looking at all your different options. So we can fund up to a maximum of 50% of the eligible costs of the network. That is inclusive of your commercialisation activities that you might ask us to help to fund. We have a capped award, so we will only fund up to a maximum of 4.5 pence per kilowatt hour of grant delivered over the first 15 years of operation. I know you'll be trying to figure out how to do that in your heads, but I'll leave that for another time for you guys. And we also have eligibility criteria. So we are looking for low carbon networks. We need to ensure that your carbon intensity of your network once built out is less than 100 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour of thermal energy. So as I say, we're probably not talking about networks that are primarily fed by gas CHP, and we are looking at waste heat sources, heat pumps, and that sort of technology here. For those of you that have external customers potentially, we're not looking for customer detriment in these. We need to protect micro businesses and domestic users. We have a social IRR requirement, which looks at calculating the benefits of carbon savings and air quality benefits as well as the financial numbers. And we have a minimum thermal demand. So for networks that are looking to come forward, we need them to be delivering at least 2 gigawatt hours of heat per annum. Next slide, please. One of the most exciting things about GHNF when BEIS brought it to market was the commitment to market transformation. So as part of applications to the scheme, we're expecting projects to commit to various points which enable growth within the supply chain. And we know from everything that Tom was telling us earlier that we've got a huge amount of work to do, lots and lots of heat networks to build out, and we need to ensure that we have the supply chain and the skills in the sector to be able to hit those commitments. So we're looking for people to make commitments to fair and open procurements, among other things, to stimulating new jobs in their local areas, and to identifying ways that we can enable investment in research and development. We've got guidance on all of this, so if this was really exciting to you, I can point you to exactly where you can read more about this. Next slide. I thought it might be interesting, knowing we have lots of people on the call today, just to reflect on what the potential roles are for the NHS in heat networks. And we've touched on a couple of them already. The simplest one may be to be one of those key anchor loads for some of these new citywide, townwide projects that are going to be built out when zoning regulations come in. That might be the easiest way that you can support heat networks in your area. Another thing that you could look at is whether it's appropriate for the NHS Trust, the hospital, the campus, to become a strategic network developer. You know, could you use energy generated on NHS sites, not only to serve hospital buildings, but to provide that low carbon, cost effective, affordable heating to the local communities that you serve as well? Could you use your existing assets or existing space on site to generate heat? I think there was a question in the chat I saw earlier about whether you could be a heat supplier, and absolutely, you know, if you are able to offer up space, waste heat, you know, generated heat that is surplus, out to an external heat network developer, could be a local authority, it could be a private developer in your area. I think that's a really exciting thing that maybe some people will be able to look at in the next you know, weeks and months. And the fourth one I've put on there is a JV partner. I'm going to talk to you about Beehive in a second, but we know that NHS trusts have a huge heat load. In many cases, you also have heat generation technology already on site, potentially space. And I think if you've got that, you know, could you offer up those assets as well as potentially some money, and become a JV partner, potentially with a private sector developer, or work alongside your local authority? Luckily, I don't think it's a one size fits all answer. I think there's opportunities for all of these things. I guess I'd just ask that when you're going away from this call and trying to digest all of this information, you know, think about what role you could play. You don't necessarily have to be the one that is applying to the Green Heat Network Fund, but you definitely have huge assets in the campus sites that many of you operate. Next slide, please. We had to put some nice pictures of pipes in here somewhere. Some of us get very excited when they see pictures like this. This is just one example of an NHS trust, St James's Hospital in Leeds, being a key anchor load for the huge multi-phase scheme that's being delivered out by Leeds Council. I think, as Mary mentioned earlier, it's certainly not the only example. We have lots of HNIP funded projects with hospitals as one of their key anchor loads. The one that always comes to mind for me is the Energetic scheme, so a very, very large scheme that's being built out in Enfield, connecting up, I'm going to get the hospital name wrong, but I think it's North Middlesex Hospital onto there. We also know that we have lots of hospitals that have their own district heating projects on site, and obviously if you are thinking about coming forward to potentially decarbonise them, just think about what else you could be doing in the wider area. Is this a bigger scheme that you could be part of? Next slide, please. So I've mentioned it already. Beehive is our heat investment vehicle. If you can go straight to the next slide, please, Sasha. It's a PCR compliant platform, so a platform that is available to all of you NHS trusts to help procure, we're using this phrase active capital now, as well as asset finance. So that active capital, really, we're talking about equity investment alongside all of those commercialisation services and expertise that can be provided by private sector investors. We have investors that have already onboarded to our DPS system. Beehive is separate from the Green Heat Network Fund, but is designed to work alongside it. If you are able to secure GHNF funding for your project, but potentially don't have the capital budget available to finance this yourself, you could come and speak to the dedicated Beehive team. They'll talk you through the options that you might have to get private investment into your project. Beehive can again be used to finance, new heat networks. You could refinance existing networks, or you could use it to help expand your networks. So if this sounds interesting, if you are a trust that has constraints on the capital available and you'd love to build out a heat network, but potentially don't have the money available at the moment, this might be a really interesting route for you. Next slide, please, Sasha. The reason that we established Beehive was to ensure that we start to give people that easy option to get private capital into networks. As much as Tom's been talking about some very big numbers, and we're talking about a £288 million grant fund, in order to build out heat networks to the level that we think we're going to need to hit those very big net zero targets. We think it's probably an £80 billion investment that's needed. And as much as there's a huge amount of money just sitting around in government waiting to be used for these things, that's going to primarily need to come from private capital. So Beehive gives that PCR compliant route to get private capital into your projects. We're hoping that it'll also help to leverage that commercial expertise and energy that private sector can bring to these projects. It enables public sector bodies to procure a partner for their network. So we know that you will have lots of outcomes that you would want to achieve from a heat network. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to lead the network. If you're able to provide a key load, if you are able to provide space, in some cases for energy centres, it could be that you're able to go to the market and request bids for funding that ensure that you still get the outcomes that you need. So if you'd like to talk about this further, we have teams of people that will be queuing up to talk to you. And importantly, the department have just agreed to extend Beehive for 2 years. So it now is running till March 2025. Next slide, please. As I said, who can use it? You're allowed. You're an NHS body, you can absolutely use this. Next slide. Alongside our work on HNIP, GHNF and Beehive, the lovely team over at LuxNova have created a suite of templated heat contracts for use by anyone involved in a district heating scheme. These are sales, operations and maintenance set. So if you are looking to to look at documenting anything for a heat network, please go and look here first. They're available on our website. There is also a guidance document on how you might use them and how you might tailor them. So please don't start from scratch. And finally, next slide, please. We have also provided some guidance for sponsors that want to understand the due diligence requirements of project finance lenders and investors. And that is our standard due diligence set. So obviously really important for people that might be considering Beehive application. So again, they're available on our website. I'm hoping that although there was a lot of information there, you'll all feel comfortable coming in, talking to the team. Libby and Amy are also available. I will pop the inquiries email address in the chat if Sam hasn't already. Otherwise, please do go and have a look on our website. There's lots of case studies on there of some of the HNIP projects, and also links to all of the guidance and information on Beehive.
Thanks, Lauren. We've had a few questions come through on the Q&A chat, but I think I'll hand over to Louise for now to talk about the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme.
Great, thank you very much, Sam. Hi everyone, my name's Louise Singleton. I work for GemServe, and we are the programme managers for the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme. So next slide, please, Sasha. So yeah, so GemServe was partnered with Ramboll to deliver the HNES demonstrator scheme, which we ran from October to May last year. And we supported 110 projects to claim over £5 million in grant funding through that scheme. We've been successfully reappointed to deliver the current main scheme. So GemServe is remaining as the sort of responsible for overall scheme delivery, the application management, monitoring and reporting, which I'll talk through later, and obviously comms and events, as Sam and Sasha are doing currently. Ramboll are our technical partners, so they are involved in the application assessments. And then we've also brought in Turner and Townsend and LuxNova to the partnership this time around. Turner and Townsend will provide pre-application support. So similarly, as Lauren just talked about, the relationship manager role under GHNF, that same role exists with Turner and Townsend in HNES, and LuxNova are there to provide legal advice, particularly around the grant funding agreements. Next slide, please. So there are three key aims and objectives of HNES. The first one is to reduce carbon emissions by making heat networks more efficient. The second one is to reduce customer detriment to improve customer confidence. And the third one is to help prepare the heat network market for sector regulation and technical standards, which obviously you've heard about earlier today. I think the key thing from an NHS perspective, we've had a number of questions through from NHS Trust so far, is around the customer detriment point. So within our guidance document, which we'll be updating shortly, it does talk about customers in need. So typically sort of low income social housing type customers. But we do also recognise that within an NHS trust, you may not necessarily have a sort of third party customer, and actually you wouldn't necessarily be providing heat to a third party source. So that doesn't mean that you're not eligible for HNES. We would very much welcome applications from heat network from NHS heat networks, and we will, as part of the assessment process, be looking at the sort of NHS as a customer in the round as part of the assessment. So so please don't think that you're not eligible. You very much are, and we will welcome your application. If we move on to the next slide, please. So the grant funding is split into two parts. So we have capital grants, of which that's up to £30 million, and this will fund up to, but not including, 50% of installation of improvement measures. So actually things like insulating pipes and various other sort of physical activities that will help to actually make real improvements to your heat network. And then on the other side, we've got the revenue grants. So this is up to £2 million. And this is essentially to get a third-party organisation to come in and have a look at your heat network. So it might be that you know that your heat network isn't performing as efficiently as it should do, but you don't necessarily know why. So there is support available to get someone to come in, have a look at your network and produce a report highlighting particular areas that you might want to focus on that would help to make improvements. The funding is split across 2 financial years, and when you're applying, you can apply for funding across both of those financial years. However, you have to spend the money you've been allocated to a particular financial year within that financial year. So a capital project, for example, if it was applying in sort of October this year, it might want to ask for some money for this financial year, and the project might continue into the next financial year, and you can't roll over any of the funding you've been awarded in the first financial year to the second one. You have to spend it within those 2 financial years. They're very distinct pots of money. Next slide, please. So who can apply? We're looking for the owners of existing district heating networks or communal heating systems. So where GH&F is supporting the development of new heat networks as well as the decarbonisation of existing ones, H&S is solely focused on improving existing heat networks. So it has to already exist to gain funding. Our heat networks can be situated in England or Wales. And yeah, public sector, private sector or third sector organisations, the same as GH&F in that sense. Ultimately, the people applying have to have the authority to sign off on investment decisions they're applying for. So essentially what we don't want is, particularly on revenue studies, consultants applying on their clients' behalves. It needs to be the heat network operator that applies and is the one that is awarded funding and signs the grant funding agreements. Okay, next slide, please. So we have 8 funding rounds. The first funding round closes next Friday, so that may be a little bit too tight now if you are only just starting to think about H&S. So the funding round 2 closes on the 19th of May, so a couple of months' time. So yeah, if you aren't ready to go quite yet, that's probably the next one to look for. And yeah, obviously all the rest of the dates follow through into the end of May 2024. Next slide, please, Sasha. So just to talk a little bit about the eligibility criteria, we do have a guidance document for applicants. So I would recommend, if you are interested in H&S, to have a look at that. That gives a lot more detail than what I can cover in these slides. But if we go to the next slide, I'll talk through at a high level what capital grants will fund, but it's probably more interesting to look at what they won't fund. So we cover anything from the energy centre and the plant room through the primary secondary distribution network and the tertiary network as well, and then metering on top of that. So the whole kind of end-to-end part of the heat network would be covered under capital grants. We move to the next slide. What we won't be able to fund is any costs that have already incurred prior to you being awarding H&S funding. Anything that's not related to the infrastructure itself, so things like improvements to building fabric, it has to be to do with the heat network. We won't fund any costs relating to engagement activities such as stakeholder management. And then specifically within the energy centre, we won't fund any costs for replacing the primary heat generation source. In that instance, we would look to direct you towards GH&F if that's something you were looking to do. For tertiary systems, we wouldn't be buying or replacing radiators. And finally, for metering, anything that's a legal requirement under the heat network metering and billing regulations, we wouldn't be funding under H&S because it's a legal requirement and it's something that you'd have to do anyway. Next slide, please. For revenue grants, these are essentially funds to produce these optimization studies. So your consultant will come in, they'll look at your existing performance of your heat network, they'll visit your sites to gather some data, they'll do an investigation to understand your current performance, and then they'll provide you with a report which will include a lot of different measures or packages of measures that would improve your heat network. These will be costed, and they will tell you the cost for improving, the savings that you would make, and the impacts that would have on particular KPIs. And at the end of that, there will be a report that you will have, and they also have to complete a optimization study outputs annex, which would come to DESNZ and ourselves, just to give a kind of summary overview of the outcome of the study. Next slide, please. Similarly, for revenue grants, any work that's already happened before your grant is awarded wouldn't be covered. Any internal staff or project management of third parties wouldn't be included, and any construction, operation and maintenance of the heat network. For revenue grants, this is solely just to understand how the heat network is performing currently and what could be done. Capital grants are for the actual sort of maintenance of a heat network, and obviously construction, again, would fall under GH&F potentially. So next slide, please. I've mentioned M&R, so it is a condition of funding that we receive regular M&R returns, and this is really vital to help us understand how projects are progressing, whether grant funding is going to be spent on time, and also to demonstrate back into government that the funding that has been allocated has offered value for money, and really helps to achieve the aims of the scheme. There are some slight differences between capital and revenue returns. So from a revenue perspective, you have to complete M&R from the moment you get your grant award until your optimization study has been delivered and signed off by DESNZ. Your monthly returns include an update on how your project is progressing, any risks and issues, and how a forecast of how you will draw down your grant funding. And as I mentioned, the final return has to include this optimization study outputs annex that the consultant will complete on your behalf. On the capital side, oh, sorry, don't mind going back one, thank you. On the capital side, again, from grant award, and then it's up to 24 months after the commissioning date. So that's to allow for us to see over 2 heat cycles how the improvements that you've made really do have an impact on how your network is performing. The same monthly returns are required as for revenue, but for capital, we would also want a quarterly return, which shows how you're progressing against the benefits and the KPIs that you said you would be looking to address as part of your application form. And again, like I said, that would be for the 24 months after your commissioning, after your commissioning date, sorry. Okay, next slide, please. So a few things to remember. The named applicant must be the heat network operator, as I said, not the consultant. So we will only pay grants to the heat network operator. That doesn't mean you can't have a consultant helping you to complete your application form. It just means that you have to be responsible for sort of uploading it and having your name as the named applicant. In terms of revenue applications, we wouldn't want to see one particular entity submitting multiple applications for revenue studies where they're very similar, and actually the lessons that are learnt from one study could be shared across other networks that you have or within other organisations. The pot for revenue applications is not massive. We want to make sure we're getting the biggest spread that we can for the money that we have. You must start work on a funded project within 3 months of signing your grant funding agreement. This is just to make sure that we're actually realising the benefits of the projects as soon as possible. And as part of your application, you need to provide us with a project plan and how you plan to spend that money and deliver your project, and this will be factored into your deliverability scoring as part of your assessment. And finally, as I've mentioned, we do have a guidance for applicants document, so please do take a look at that if you have if you are interested in HNS and you want to understand a bit more about the scheme. Right, next slide, please. Yeah, next one as well. So just talking about the relationship manager service that we have as well. We have a number of different people that you can talk to if you want to get more specific information about your particular scheme. They'll be able to provide you with guidance on the application form and the scheme in general. And then on the other side, if you have a general inquiry about HNS, if you want to be added to our mailing list, or if you'd like an application form, then please email hnes@gemserve.com. And again, we have another team who'd be able to support you on that side of things. Just one last thing I wanted to highlight. DESNZ has recently published a number of guidance videos. So the link is on the slides. And these just give a real kind of quick, they're only sort of a few minutes long, guidance on particular different parts of the heat network and where you might want to have a look at if you know that you've got a particular issue. It might be worth taking a look at those first, as they can give some real useful guidance on how to improve the efficiency of your heat network. So I'd recommend checking those out. All right, I think that's my last slide. Oh yeah, so just a reminder of key dates. So yeah, funding round 1, if you are looking to apply, is closing next Friday. If you want to submit an application, you need to request a SharePoint site from us at hnes@gemserve.com by this Friday. So please do get those requests in. Otherwise, funding round 2 closes on the 19th of May. Fabulous. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Louise. We've had some really great questions come through, and the vast majority of them have been answered by our speakers throughout the session today. However, there were a few that I thought it might be worth us just touching on, and I was wondering whether, Mary, whether you could comment on the role that NHS England can play in supporting some of our attendees today in sort of navigating the landscape. There's quite a few different schemes that we've discussed, and there was a couple of questions in regard to the role that you might play.
No, absolutely. Am I live? Okay, great. Thank you for that. Yes, so I mean, one of the roles that we can play, I mean, putting this event together is one of that, that role that we saw the importance of bringing you guys together to talk to the trust directly. But on the back of this, we intend to put some guidance documents together that helps you navigate, especially more of a flow chart and a roadmap that helps you navigate this funding, timelines, deadlines. And someone made a very important comment around how this links with things like PSDS, which we are accessing that quite significantly, but utilizing the funds that's available for heat networks as well. So there is that piece of work that will happen, but I think beyond that as well, we've got the regional delivery groups as well, and on the back of which potentially to actually create focus groups, which looks at heat networks and bringing trust at different stages of the development of their networks together, so that you can learn from each other from that perspective as well. But we're also starting to look at the HTML 702. I know that when you start thinking about the heating regimes of your existing network and potentially connecting to other networks, that there can be a barrier there as well, and looking at how we help to remove those barriers through that as well. Other kind of barriers and challenges, especially when you start thinking about the potential disconnect with like your CDL limits and stuff like that as well, are more longer term issues that the NHSE is looking to address as well, or support how we trust in navigating that So this is an emerging area for the NHS, and especially given that some trusts may fall within heat network zones, we need to kind of ramp up capacity for the NHS to be able to not just develop new networks, but also look to optimize existing ones as well. So yeah, there is going to be quite a number of work streams coming out on the back of this.
Great, thanks, Mary. There was been a couple of questions that are very specific to individual projects, and I think I've responded to most of them. If I haven't, please do reach out, because we'd love to speak to you to find out a bit more about your individual projects. It's quite difficult sometimes to provide a general answer with very little information. So if you do have a scheme that you'd like to talk to us about, then do drop us an email. We will be sending around the slides and the recording from today. We will also be issuing answers to all of the questions in a document, so hopefully that will be useful for everyone that's attended and those that haven't been able to attend today. We know that we've covered a lot of content today, and some of the schemes may seem to be a bit confusing when you're quite new to the area. So do feel free to reach out, and we're happy to clarify anything that has been raised today. I'm just going to check and see if we've had any other new questions through. So comment around NHS Seedale and Ardell. Mary, which you might want to pick up outside of the session. Question regarding HNES and low temperature hot water rather than steam. I think we'll take that one away and get our technical team to get back to you. So if you could just comment with your email address, that'd be great, and we can reach out to you directly on that particular point. I think we've answered the vast majority of questions today. We really appreciate you joining us. We will be in touch with all of the materials. Thank you so much.